The destroyer Warwick was Admiral Keyes' flagship on St. George's Day at Zeebrugge in 1918, and the cabin bulkhead was adorned with a disc commemorating that fact. As the reproduction I first saw at Wembley, depicting the memorable attack, has influenced all my life, I have always felt a special bond, a sympathy established between me and that ship, which created a special atmosphere. The people who lived here at different times left behind an aura of joy and light sadness that over time became as integral to the ship as its metalwork. The atmosphere on the Warwick was so serenely joyful that it was even surprising, and it was felt by any person who had barely stepped on its deck. The Warwick radiated human warmth from every bulkhead. It was the first ship I had ever taken on full alert. I'd come to Loch Tulla and Verbena when only the hulls were fully built, and the Shikari was in serious trouble with her crew. The Warwick, on the other hand, was the right ship, exactly as she should have been. Its previous captain, Commander McLeaves, was, in my opinion, one of the finest of the CWR, and this praise is fully deserved. The ship was exactly as I would have arranged it myself. She had just returned to port after escorting another ocean convoy and was standing at the quay wall of Gladstone Dock in Liverpool, looking elegant and very attractive. I arrived at the dock alone, with no warning to anyone, to get a feel for my first encounter with a new ship. There is nothing more exciting than a new captain's first encounter with the ship that will become his brainchild as soon as he walks up the narrow gangway to the deck. The mysteries of a ship's character are learned rather quickly, and can be judged by many minute details. Therefore, when the captain takes the first step from the pier to the gangway, he already knows quite a lot about the ship. He even has his first guesses as to how good her seaworthiness is, and whether she is merciful to people at sea. As old weapons improved and new ones appeared, it became increasingly difficult to accommodate the increasing crew on older ships. The Shikari, originally designed for 100 men, accommodated more than 140. The crew of the Warwick was to be 120 men. When I took command, it had already increased to 170. To accommodate the additional men, it was converted into an escort destroyer. In doing so, the bow tube and boiler room were eliminated. In the lower part of the vacated space placed additional fuel tanks, which allowed to increase its autonomy, and above them built a new living deck for boiler machinists. To make room on the tank, the galley was moved outside and placed where the bow tube had been. This conversion reduced the destroyer's speed from 30 knots to 25 knots, and she would indeed have made an excellent escort ship had her hull not leaked in many places due to her advanced old age. Some people think that small leaks cannot cause much trouble, because the incoming water is easily pumped out. But there are fuel tanks in the bottom of the ship, and water getting into them spoils the fuel. After the Shikari, my new ship seemed huge. I could walk everywhere without bending my head, so I felt great. The captain's quarters were located across the ship, with different cabins for daytime and nighttime sleeping. Although I could hardly expect to spend any time in them while at sea, I was assured of unprecedented comfort while at anchor. My sea cabin was also surprisingly comfortable, and was close to the captain's bridge, which I could get to very quickly if necessary. And since the entire bridge was much higher than on the Shikari, I could no longer fear the constant streams of water that were always bubbling on the floor of my previous sea cabin. Since my favourite pastime ashore was friendly parties to repay the hospitality shown and enjoy good wine in good company, it was great to know that I now had plenty of room for that. I had always carried a lot of photographs, a few good paintings, and during my wanderings around the world I had amassed a small art collection. My greatest pride was a collection of old Arabian and Persian horse bridles, which I had collected while travelling to the northwestern frontier of India. To the no-nonsense astonishment of my guides, I visited all the bazaars in small towns where no Europeans had been seen for years, in search of these trophies. Why does a Sahib commander pay 4 rupees for this old stuff when he can buy a new one for 3 rupees? The guides always asked me, and my rantings about the exquisite work of the old masters and the fact that my purchase was at least 200 years old did not satisfy anyone. I believed that the war should not prevent people from decorating their everyday life, so in my cabin there were always fresh flowers in large, beautiful vases. I was very proud of the furnishings of my cabin, and even after all my belongings perished with the ship, I did not regret taking them with me. Of course, there were officers who believed that in time of war the most proper principle of life should be Spartan simplicity. But personally, I could never understand why I would deliberately deprive myself of comforts if I could not, and I did not believe that stoicism could increase combat effectiveness. Besides, I realized long ago that if I try to make my cabin a real home, the crew realizes that I consider the ship my home. A ship is a strange place, and sailors are strange creatures. They are strictly forbidden to bring alcohol on board or to invite women on board, except on special occasions. However, sailors love it when their officers throw parties, at least as long as they don't go overboard. At heart, the vast majority of sailors are men of strict rules. If they see that everything is going well and the officers are having a good time, they are relaxed. If the entertainment goes too far, there's bound to be trouble. And if you don't invite any friends aboard at all and live a hermit's life, the sailors immediately suspect any unnatural inclinations and suffer for it. They want you to behave at home among friends. Commander I. McLeaves, a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross and Distinguished Combat Service Cross, was one of the first unit commanders. He progressed, as I did, from group commander, then became a corvette commander, and from there came to the Warwick. Of the first group and unit commanders in the Western Ocean, there were now only two left, Commander Wemyss, who had served on the Wild Goose, and myself. I found that the Warwick was due for another overhaul and was just awaiting word on which dry dock to follow. A day or two later the order came to go to Grimsby. At the same time I was summoned by the Chief of Staff. He said that the tactical school had put forward a new theory that there should be two senior officers in each group. One would be on the bridge of the ship, the leader of the group, and the other would do the laying up. He wanted me, having placed the Warwick in dock, to join Commander R.K. Boyle, go to sea with him on the destroyer Havelock, and make the voyage to Newfoundland and back. Afterward he desired a report from both of us as to how the idea would work in practice. Commander Boyle was the senior officer of my B5 group, but since the Warwick had gone for repairs, we had not yet had occasion to meet. On paper, the idea seemed reasonable, but I figured that both Boyle and I would need the utmost self-control to avoid conflict. However, the idea could only be tested by experience, so I agreed. Leaving the Warwick at the dock, I crossed the whole of England and boarded the destroyer Havelock. Within an hour of my arrival, we were already out to sea. As I had feared, the proposed scheme proved totally unworkable. In the previous chapter, I described how, when an enemy submarine is attacked, laying aids can help determine what is going on and make the right decision. Commander Boyle, standing on the bridge, was in the same position as the reader before the purpose of the spacer was explained to him. I, on the other hand, being at the pad setter, was in complete control of the situation, including the movement of Commander Boyle's ship. Even a saint could not bear to have his ship driven by someone else, and the chief officer of a group of ships is certainly no saint. Besides, we were polar opposites in temperament. Boyle was slow, neat, and boringly pedantic. Everything he did was deliberate and carefully considered. He was also incredibly clean, and somehow militantly neat. I, on the other hand, am rather impulsive, usually acting impulsively, impetuously, sometimes carelessly, and certainly no one in the world would dare to call me overly neat. We couldn't agree on every little thing, and there were even disputes over such things as the choice of sherry. One thing we agreed on was that the idea of dual management was the craziest idea we had ever tried. The fact that it didn't come to hand combat was a credit to our upbringing and the discipline instilled during our years of service. Staying on different ships, we would treat each other with deep respect and make a great team. He was my senior officer, and I was obliged to follow his orders. In general, we both learned only one thing from this unfortunate experience together: he who controls the movement of the ship commands the battle. After that, the wise minds of our tactical school generated the following idea: the senior officer of the group should be at the plotter and map at all times and keep an eye on the plotting, while his ship should be handled by the captain in the meantime. This solution was somewhat better than the scheme originally proposed, which Boyle and I flatly rejected, but still far from ideal. Our ships are not large enough to have room for both a senior officer and a captain. In fact, the solution was obvious, and thank goodness it was the one that was arrived at. The senior officer must have a very experienced and reliable chief mate who can steer the ship if necessary. Then the senior officer can retire to the chart and instruments and monitor the overall situation. We passed through waters where we were told there were many German submarines, but no attacks were made. This was probably good for maintaining friendly relations between us, but did not help us gain the experience we needed. Reports from aircraft about the detection of submarines was a lot, and therefore enough maneuvers of escort ships, aimed at keeping the enemy underwater, so that the opinion that the tested scheme was unacceptable was justified. On my return, I visited the Chief of Staff to consult on the contents of a future report, which could only be directed against the idea. The latter replied that Boyle had already submitted a very scathing paper, and he saw no reason to write another. It seems to me that the Chief of Staff did not expect any other result. We left St. John's on Newfoundland on Boxing Day, the second day after Christmas 1943. On arrival, I spent one night at home, where I brought 2 frozen fish, and then hurried to Grimsby in time to prepare the Warwick for the convoy that was going to sea in January. The plan was for us to leave Grimsby on the 11th, but we were delayed until the 13th. It was on this day that the convoy was leaving Liverpool. However, by properly spurring. The cars, we managed to join the group when the merchant ships were still forming into a marching order off the north coast of Ireland. The convoy was fast and was expected to sail at 9 knots, but a strong westerly wind had risen and the ships were having serious difficulty shifting into position. The wind from the west had been blowing for 2 weeks already. Now it was joined by a no-nonsense swell. January 1944 gave us a not-too-good gift, the most inclement weather of the whole war. The escort group consisted of the Havelock, 3 more destroyers Warwick, Vimy and Volantia, and 2 corvettes with Belgian crews Buttercup and Godatia. Great difficulties arose with the formation of the convoy. That night we never managed to arrange the ships in their places, and by morning all lay adrift. During the first 24 hours we travelled 80 miles in a westerly direction. On the second day this achievement decreased to 52 miles, and on the third day to 40 miles. In other words, we were making 1.5 knots per hour. The weather did not wish to improve, and the excitement only increased. Havelock lost her mainmast and went to Iceland for repairs. And I was left in charge of the escort. 10 merchant ships returned to England with various damage to their superstructures, and 15 ships were somewhere fighting the weather alone, where we didn't know exactly. The convoy had already dwindled from 50 to 25 ships, scattered over a vast area along with the escort ships which were out of range of each other. Waves were flooding the Warwick, with cold green water 2 to 3 feet deep rolling over the upper deck. I temporarily relocated the watch officers to the ship's sick bay and closed off the upper deck to walking. At the very slow speed at which the convoy was travelling, my ship was poorly steered. I had to go faster, which meant making a wide zigzag to avoid overtaking the convoy. So we were constantly changing course and angling toward the high waves instead of going straight at them, thus providing ourselves with at least a minimum of comfort. Soon after I had closed the upper deck, the motorboat was washed overboard with the davits, and in half an hour they were followed by the Velboat. We then found that all the drinking water was in the forward part of the ship and the bread in the aft part. We solved the problem by throwing the end from the bridge to the stern with a rocket launcher, whence we were handed the bread in a life jacket. In exchange we handed over water. Shortly after dawn, the chief mechanic called from the engine room to tell us that we must have lost something from the deck, too much water coming in through holes in the deck directly above him. I went to the aft end of the bridge and inspected the deck. At first glance there was nothing wrong. When I returned to the compass, the chief mate was just changing watch and was about to go below for breakfast. I said, "Number 1, the chief thinks we've got something washed off the deck aft from the pipe. There's water pouring into the engine room. I looked from here, but didn't see anything unusual. If you don't mind, see for yourself what he's thinking up." I watched carefully as the leather-clad figure moved cautiously along the deck toward the stern. Soon it disappeared from view behind the sonar room. A few minutes later the figure reappeared. The XO was clearly agitated and moving much less cautiously. Trying to shout over the wind, he shouted, "The 3-inch is gone," along with the platform. And so it goes. The 3-inch gun went overboard with the platform on which it was mounted, without even bending the rail to show exactly where it happened. This morning went our 5th day at sea. Weather damage was reported from the Vimy and Volantia. By this time the number of convoy ships was down to 20, so I ordered the destroyers to return to England. The 2 corvettes were much better suited to such conditions than the destroyers and were fairly easy to manoeuvre, so I sent them out to count how many babies were left in the cradle, and at the same time to see if the escort tanker was still with us. 1 corvette reported 20 ships, the other 21. But unfortunately there was no tanker. We had no fuel to cross the Atlantic without refueling, so the problem seemed extremely serious. The coming night was even worse than the previous ones, if such a thing was even possible, and in the morning we found only 8 merchant ships in sight. I sent a radiogram to the commander. The convoy has been scattered by the incessant storm. Only 8 vessels remain with me. The Warwick will need repairs in dry dock when we return to port. All fuel tanks are leaking. German submarines cannot operate in this weather. I request permission to return. Toward evening, I received a one-word reply. Approve. Calling 2 corvettes to us, we turned our ship's stern to the wind, and with engine speeds corresponding to 7 knots, headed for home at an actual speed of 10 knots. The Belgians made a fine display of themselves. There may have been an odour on their accommodation decks, unaccustomed to our Anglo-Saxon noses, but the crews acted very coherently and, most importantly, diligently. The land reader may think that such a thing is possible, but in fact an ocean-going ship cannot go faster than the waves. A large wave travels at 45 knots, which is more than the speed of any ship. Even if you go close to that speed, the propellers will pull the stern down rather than lifting it at all, and the catching up waves will flood the deck. We were now able to open the motion on the upper deck. The ship was moving without much difficulty, but when the giant waves came from the stern and passed under us, the hull flexed so much that the steering rods between the wheelhouse and the steering gear kept getting stuck. The sturdy watertight bulkheads between the engine room and boiler room cracked and burst like cookie tins. The rumbling could be heard even on the upper deck. After dinner I stood on the bridge for a long time, gazing into the distance. The sea seemed to have gone completely mad. From the stern we were being overtaken by gigantic shafts of water, topped by foamy caps 5 or 6 feet high. The stern would surge upward, the bow would dive downward. The wave would pass under us, and the same thing would happen, only in reverse. The stern would sink and the bow would scoot upward. The stern would sink until, looking back, the next wave seemed at least twice its actual size. And it must be admitted that its true height was also daunting. For the first time in my life I clearly felt that the wind in the hollow between the waves was perceptibly weaker than at the crest. Our little boat was bravely tipping her tail, as if in mockery of the fury of the elements. A thrilling sight. I watched it for quite a while, but suddenly I felt something had changed. The sky to the northwest of us suddenly became unbelievably black, but even in the thickening inky darkness, the surface of the water was clearly visible. Compared to the new, unearthly blackness, the water seemed strangely light, and the ship darkened sharply against it. As I pondered what it all meant, I noticed an approaching squall. It was about a mile away and approaching from the northwest at about 80 miles per hour. I had read a lot about sailing vessels caught in squalls and knew, at least from the literature, how it could end. A squall catches up with a sailboat, engulfs it and takes down all the masts as it brings with it a wind that suddenly changes direction by 45 to 90 degrees. I've seen small squalls before, but they didn't even closely resemble what was in front of us now. It was marked by a single wave adorned with a frothy crest, as high and fierce as the ones that were coming at us from the west. After a few seconds, I realized that this new wave would meet one of the old ones just astern of us. Holding my breath, I waited. The stern began to rise up, it scooted higher and higher, and then out of the wind the ship now resembled a small dinghy being tossed onto the open shore. It turned and took the foaming wall of water on board. I felt it turn and realized the helmsman had lost control. I rushed down the storm ladder to the wheelhouse deck. The ship had turned. For several heartbreaking seconds I struggled with the door, which would not open. I later learned that water had rushed onto the living decks, and our old boatswain, an exceptionally God-fearing individual, had nearly drowned in the cloister. I stood up to my neck in the water, he reported later, and swore at myself. I didn't expect such blasphemy myself, sir. I managed the door and saw a derelict helm in the middle of the deckhouse. In the far corner could be seen some sort of shapeless heap with arms and legs sticking out of it. It turned out to be the helmsman and messenger. I rushed to the machine telegraph, not at all due to good athletic form, but by sheer chance I managed to hold on with the toe of one foot and the toes of my hand. I called out, ordering full reverse to the right engine and stop machine to the left. At this time there was a cry of man overboard, but there was nothing I could do. It was my duty to take care of the ship. I felt it vibrate. The starboard engine started to reverse. Thank God. The ship was levelling off. The compass bowl returned to its place in the nactos. The compass card shifted and began a slow circular motion. The ship was turning east. It rocked violently once more, making my stomach make a quick run to my throat, and moved briskly forward. I picked up the helm and called the engine room, ordering it to give 70 RPM to both engines. Wheelhouse to bridge. I shouted into the voice tube. Bridge. I'm here, Mac. At the helm. Thank God, sir. We were afraid it was you who'd fallen overboard. I'll stay here for now. What happens to the man overboard? I don't know exactly who it is, but one of ours fell in. I'm sorry, but I'm not taking any chances. Even if people don't understand me. You can't sacrifice everyone for one. And besides, we can't find him now. I'll be at the helm until the sea returns to normal. I steered the ship all night. She steadied her course. At dawn the wind began to die down, or at least the first signs of it. A helmsman I could trust showed up for the noon watch. I gave him the watch and went to breakfast. As I feared, the men were grumbling. I sent for the helmsman. He was a fine man, and really disliked having to say unpleasant things to me. Finally, he said that the people were very sad about the death of a comrade. In their opinion, I was to go back and start a search. I wrote a note and ordered the helmsman to pin it on the bulletin board. The decision was made by me, not you. I will have to answer for it to a board of inquiry, which will certainly be assembled. Until the commission makes its decision, you should, for the good of the ship, refrain from criticizing me. And to the board I say this. It would have been extremely dangerous to turn the ship back at that time and under the prevailing weather conditions. I did not want to jeopardize the lives of 170 men to save one who, even if by pure chance we had managed to find him, would no longer need our help. I would prefer to say all of this to you personally, but I can't leave the bridge just yet. Half an hour after this note had appeared on the bulletin board, a delegation, the helmsman, the boatswain and the chief boiler engineer came to the bridge. They thanked me on behalf of the crew and apologized for the unflattering words spoken to me. That same morning we spotted a tanker that had sustained considerable damage in the weather and was slowly heading home. Before the storm it had also been torpedoed. The sailors could not repair the damage on their own. The ship's hull had already begun to break in half. We called a tugboat by radio and stayed by the side until we met a tugboat near Barra Head, to which we handed over the unfortunate cripple. Half an hour later the tanker broke in half and sank. The crew were rescued by a tugboat. We came to Londonderry and from there to Ardrossan to dry dock. On January 12th we left the dock, and on January 22nd we returned again. The storm had taken its toll on the B-5 ships. All 4 destroyers were badly damaged, and the older ones required serious repairs. Only 2 corvettes remained in seaworthy condition. Leaving the ship at the dock, I hurried to Liverpool to see the Admiral. I'm afraid the old destroyers are no longer in condition to stay in the Western Ocean, he said, and added I have new escort ships coming from the United States. Yes, and I've been asked to send some destroyers to Plymouth. They need help in preparing for the invasion and in dealing with the German torpedo boats that are operating from the Channel Islands and interfering with shipping along the South Shore. Our gunboats can't handle the weather, and the Germans should be taught a lesson. You will get 1 or 2 more VWs and all your old S-class destroyers. How do you feel about such an assignment? The submarine war was slowly but surely coming to an end by that time. An invasion was scheduled for the summer. Anyway, I found the idea very tempting. "Are we going to stay in the Western Approaches fleet?" I asked. "Yes, you'll be mine. I'll just loan you out to Plymouth for a while. And can I remove the Hedgehog from my ship and replace the forward 4-inch gun? You can have whatever you can scrounge up from the others." So I went looking for a 4-inch gun. It seemed to me the most logical step to start at the Admiralty, and so the first thing I did was to go to London. Turns out I was wrong. I travelled many corridors, met with all sorts of high-ranking and very serious officers who must have thought me a dangerous madman, but achieved no result. Then I headed further north. After spending 2 days in Glasgow, I did find the gun I wanted, which had just been removed from one of the VWW destroyers. It was considerably more difficult to get it. The solution depended on various people who demanded that I put my request in writing. It would be forwarded to higher authorities, then to still higher authorities, and so on. Eventually a decision would be made, and I would certainly be informed of it. "Dear Mr. Official," I exclaimed, "my ship leaves on Sunday. Today is Tuesday. Do you really think there is time for bureaucratic correspondence about a cannon that should be on board no later than Friday?" The cannon arrived on the contractor's truck on Friday at 2 o'clock. We put to sea on Sunday, February 13th. Old sailors state that one should not go to sea on Sunday, and even a child knows the omen concerning the number 13. We completed all the necessary trials, and on the 17th set course for Plymouth, where we arrived on the evening of the 19th. I went ashore to visit the captain. The windows of his office overlooked the river, so that he could see everything that was going on without getting up from his desk. "I want to congratulate you," he said, "on a fine ship. It's been a long time since anyone has walked in here with such confidence. I like it when it's done thoroughly. You've been here before, I take it?" "Only once, sir." Well, we'll see you again. Right now, the commander's waiting for you. The car's here." By the way, the Warwick did look pretty good. Since we painted the Verbena to the waterline in Gibraltar 3 years ago, I've never been able to paint an entire ship at once. But at Ardrossan the whole crew was still on board. The men had only recently returned from vacation, and painting the hull was quite an undertaking. The Admiral ordered to take the Scimitar and intercept a German submarine expected to appear west of Cornwall. I said that our Aztec was not behaving too well, so the anti-submarine staff officer, Commander J. W. Heath, received urgent orders to go to sea with us and take care of the stroppy device. That same night we rounded Land's End and began patrolling. We had another S-class destroyer with us. This kind of warfare was new to us. Long convoys of convoys passed us by. Fishing boats of all types and sizes were snooping around. Our radar screen reflected the echo of small ships, and a German submarine, led by a determined captain, could well pass where she needed to go, unnoticed. The morning found us in the same area. Patrolling continued. It was a clear, cloudless, sunny morning, but very cold. For an hour we practiced firing on radar readings. If we were to hunt for torpedo boats, we would have to rely mainly on radar rather than Aztec. It would now be our main tool. At noon I sent for the chief mechanic and chief mate and expressed my displeasure at the condition of the boiler machinist's living quarters. I also sent a message to my own ship's Aztec operator and to Commander Heath, expressing my dissatisfaction with the Aztec and requesting that action be taken. All these officers had gathered in the wardroom before lunch, and I had, without realizing it myself, saved their lives by gathering everyone in the forward area. The anti-submarine officer who had taken over the Aztec called and said he would like to shut down the rig for half an hour. I agreed to do so. I then proceeded to discuss with the XO and XO the problems associated with the living quarters. Suddenly the sky erupted in flames and the ship shook violently. Then the flames disappeared and, as far as I could tell, everything around remained strangely the same as it had been before the strange phenomenon. As I looked ahead, I saw something large floating on the water, looking like a giant metal whale. As I stared at the strange object in bewilderment, it swayed and turned slightly. It had our number written on it. I was stunned. There was no way that could have happened. Coming out of my stupor, I ran to the aft side of the bridge and looked down. The ship ended just past the engine room. There was nothing further. What I saw ahead was the stern of our own ship. The chief mate was already down below organising the fire crews. He saw me and asked, "Are you going to abandon ship, sir?" "Hell no, number one. Get the fire dealt with, then get all the rescue gear down here and secure it securely. We're not leaving the ship until we're forced to do so." I'm back on the compass platform. Signalman. "Sir, transmit to the scimitar. I think I've been torpedoed, then beam down to the main deck. Yeoman, you too, but first gather up all your papers and take them to the radio room. Take all the charts you can find and take them there as well. Don't forget to lock the door." The watch officer continued to stand at the compass. I wondered in passing how long he'd stay like that. The torpedo must have hit the powder magazine, and the stern must have been blown clean off, I said. He leaned over to the voice pipe and shouted, "Stop both cars." The propellers went down with the stern. I grinned. "You'd better go down to the main deck and help the XO." He left, and I was alone on the bridge. It was strangely calm. I took off my boots and tried to inflate my life jacket. It wouldn't fill with air. I patted myself on the back and found that the rubber tubes were torn, and the vest itself. It must have been an accidental splinter. I've always made a point of throwing life jackets in the wheelhouse. Maybe there's one there for me right now. I went down to look. It was empty. Perhaps my last criticism had worked after all. I stepped out of the deckhouse. The ship was upright and clearly well in the water. A variety of life preservers were hanging from all sides on the sides they were tied down with ropes. No fires were visible anywhere the XO had done well. It looked like we might yet be able to save the ship. Then I heard a strange sound for which I could find no explanation. The deck began to tilt rapidly, and too suddenly the ship was lying on its side. I slid down the inclined plane, trying in vain to grab onto anything I could get my hands on. My world had flipped 90 degrees. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the navigator, Harris, moving cautiously along the high side of the main deck. In both hands he held a wooden box, a chronometer, and a sextant. Somehow this struck me as incredibly funny. I jumped to the galley pipe, which was now parallel to the water and rose 2 feet above it, and crawled up it. I could see water pouring into the main pipe. The sound was like water flowing out of a giant bathtub. The surface of the water around me was covered with floating people. I paused, staying on the tip of the pipe, and looked around. People were laughing, as if they were participating in some sort of amusement. I was called out of the water. "Jump in with us, sir, the water is lovely." "I'll stay on the shore a little longer," I said. But the pipe that was supporting me quickly sank into the water, and with it I had to swim. The man beside me looked back and shouted, "He's drowning." "Swim." I shouted, convinced he was right. "Swim faster, it will suck." And I desperately worked with my arms and legs. When I looked around again, I couldn't see any more people, only a few heads sticking out of the water. I swam on. A destroyer of our group passed by. I saw that the men had taken their places according to the battle schedule. Lord have mercy. They're attacking. They were attacking the wreck of the Warwick. I shouted in a frenzy, but of course no one heard me. The German submarine could have been anywhere but here. The depth charges were wasted. I'd never noticed the funny way they sway when they sink. I wondered. I thought, what would happen when they started exploding? It turned out to be no big deal. I was expecting the worst. It's like a low blow to the chest. My consciousness went hazy. I didn't know where I was floating. All I saw were waves, lots of waves, damn it. Why are there so many of them? I wished they'd stop bothering me. Then I felt someone grab me roughly by the shoulders, and I heard a voice. "Jesus Christ, it's the captain. Help me drag him in." And I was dragged into the crowded life raft without ceremony. "Are there any officers here?" I exhaled. "Yes, sir." "Miss Indo." "Then, for God's sake, Miss Indo, send someone into the water, have them float alongside in the slings, or this thing will capsize. You can throw me out if you like, just get on with it." I've always thought that small life rafts flip over too easily. We've even done separate experiments and proved that these life rafts are very unstable. They are easy to launch and at first glance offer a solid chance of rescue, so they always end up being overloaded. I have always seen to it that the rafts on my ships are provided with ropes about 6 feet long, attached at intervals to a leer around the edge of the raft. Should it become overloaded, the men will be able to remain in the water by strapping on the ropes. In this way, the stability of this life-saving device is guaranteed and the number of people rescued is increased. Miss Indo was the first to go overboard and found that the water temperature was not favourable for prolonged swimming, followed by several others. The result was that our raft rocked on the waves quite steadily. About 200 yards away from us, I noticed another raft. It had not followed our example, and it looked overloaded to the extreme. It must have actually capsized in the end, and the men then couldn't climb back in, because when it was discovered it was empty. And we were hoisted aboard the fishing boat Lady Luck and taken to Padstow. The fishing boat's tiny room could barely fit 12 people and a red-hot ancient stove. Cock handed out cups of scalding tea to everyone in turn. It was about an hour's walk to the harbour. About halfway there, we felt the warmth slowly returning to our bodies, and with it, life. I was the first to venture out of my soaked clothes. When we docked, the drifter's captain lent me a raincoat, in which I went ashore. Admiral A.G. Crawford, the naval representative at Padstow, met us at the wharf. On the way to his office, I noticed 3 other trawlers rounding the cape. No matter how hard I peered into the distance, no other vessels were visible. The Admiral gave me a wool-plaid blanket to cover my nakedness and a very old cap with a small visor that he himself had worn during World War I. I can imagine how I looked. I can imagine what I looked like in that cap and plaid and with my naked, black, Negro-like legs sticking out from underneath. I think it was the oil film that saved my life, because I got into a warm room only after 2 hours. There was a cold wind blowing the whole time, and the temperature was about 0. After calling the captain in Plymouth, I went back to the dock. I wanted to meet my men myself and make a list of survivors as soon as possible. It was low tide and the trawlers couldn't get close to shore. People were being transported by boat. I could not believe that 3 trawlers had delivered all the survivors of the disaster and waited for other ships to come. I was hardly convinced that only 4 trawlers went to the place of destroyer's destruction, and all of them returned. The ships did not enter other ports. And I had to come to terms with the idea that the crew survived 94 people. The explosion of the Warwick's powder cellar was seen by many, including pilots from St. Merrin Naval Airfield. When the men were brought ashore, everything was ready to receive them. The sailors were immediately put on buses and driven to the airfield. After sending everyone off, Admiral Crawford and I went around to all 4 trawlers to thank the captains, and only then did he take me to the airfield in his car. At St. Merrin's we were received beautifully. The first thing they did was to help me wash the dried oil film off my body. We tried everything: soap, technical detergents, and even high-octane gasoline. The latter did the best job, but caused extremely unpleasant sensations when it got on the delicate parts of the body. After refueling, I wanted to rest, but I learned that our bosun had been placed in a nearby hospital, so I took the car and went to see him. He was a reservist and not an old man, probably too old for the oversaturated events of today. He was in very bad shape, but he recognized me and was genuinely pleased. During the night he died quietly and peacefully in his sleep. The shock had taken its toll. The next evening the Padre held a special service for us. Attendance was strictly voluntary, but every one of us came. That same night I sent a telegram to my wife: "Don't believe the rumours, they're lies." The navigator, D.H. Harris, survived, but unfortunately his sextant and chronometer suffered a sadder fate. For 20 minutes he floundered in the water holding both instruments, but then decided that one would have to be parted with. He thought long and hard about which one to let sink, and finally settled on the chronometer. As he explained to me later, he realized that the chronometer was a more expensive instrument, but it would also cost more to repair. For a while he swam in cold water, with his sextant in his arms, but soon realized that he would have to sacrifice that too, unless of course he wanted to go to the bottom in the company of this undoubtedly useful navigational device. Ironically, however, at the very moment when he let go of the sextant, he was grabbed by the shoulders and pulled up onto the raft. The navigator immediately began to break free, trying to dive for the sextant, which was slowly disappearing into the depths. The sailor, who tried to save him, decided that the victim had gone crazy and knocked him out so that he would not interfere with saving himself. The next day we were taken to Plymouth by bus. Amazingly, the men retained their team spirit. Discipline was maintained at the highest level, people sang all the way, and their songs were not dull at all. The repertoire included Widdicombe Fair, Jolly Ploughman and many other folk songs that I heard for the first time. Usually people behave this way on their way to a picnic or outing. Most likely, though, there was something else behind the outward cheerfulness. It seemed to me that there was a kind of unbreakable bond between them, the way people are united by the hardships they have experienced together. As we drove along the sunlit roads of Cornwall, I thought, I feel sorry for the Germans. Personally, I would never want to fight against people like that. As we disembarked from the bus in the square in front of Davenport Crew, we were still the crew of the Warwick. Sailors often look to their officers for help, and the occasions are varied. I remember one reservist who had a shoe size so small that there was nothing even close to that in the Davenport Crew depots. We called the women's auxiliary superintendent, and within half an hour we had the right pair of shoes. In the captain's cabin of His Majesty's ship Glasgow, a board of inquiry met. It was customary to do so in such cases to make sure that all precautions had been taken, to check the observance of discipline by officers and sailors. As a matter of fact, there was only one doubt: could we have blown ourselves up in our own minefield? Fortunately, Harris memorized the bearing he took a few minutes before the explosion to determine the location of the ship, and all doubts were eliminated. Oh, and the German radio reported the sinking of the destroyer. Apparently, the submarine we were looking for fired an acoustic torpedo at us, which hit the stern near the propellers and exploded the powder cellar. Warwick might have stayed afloat if the aft bulkhead of the engine room had held. When the chairman of the committee reported that he was clear and no further testimony was required, we were given freedom to go on leave. That evening we assembled for the last time as members of the Warwick's crew. A smiling helmsman came up to me. "I have 23 requests here, sir," he said, and showed me a small stack of papers. Requests, helmsman. I don't think that's for me right now. Even if I had the time, I don't have the authority to do it. What do they want? They all want to get on your next ship, sir. Of course, I couldn't honour my men's request at that moment, but the memory of it warmed me on the way home, and the very next day I went to Liverpool to see the Admiral. When I entered, he stood up. "I'm very sorry, Rayner." "So am I, sir. Will you give me another ship?" "Of course, if that's what you want. But I thought you could work ashore for a while. You've been at sea so long." "If you trust me, sir, please give me another ship." "Of course." He sat down and pointed me to another chair. "By losing a ship, you have gained experience that could prove invaluable, and you will become an even better commander. You can go to America and take one of the captain-class frigates. Work up what you need to do in Bermuda, and try to get a good night's rest while you're there." "A captain-class frigate." There was obvious horror in my voice. "Why not?" "They're fine ships." "But I don't want to walk the Atlantic with a USA branded on my ass." He looked at me carefully, his eyes, usually light and very bright, darkened when he really thought about it. "What is it you want?" "A destroyer with 2 tubes. For God's sake, Rayner. I've only got 4 of those left, and there's a line of career sailors for them all the time." "Anything that can sink German submarines will do, sir, but the twin-tube destroyers are my favourite." I told the Admiral everything I thought and went home with a sense of accomplishment. No sooner had I crossed the threshold than the telephone rang. I immediately sensed that it was the commander's office calling and picked up the receiver. The first thing I heard was the voice of the telephone operator. "The Admiral's secretary will be speaking to you." Then another voice came through the phone. "Rayner?" "Yes." "Can you be in Trun tomorrow evening?" I had to think fast. "If we're talking about 2 pipes, yes." "But you realise," his voice warmed a little, "that you'll have to give up your vacation." "As I understand it, the ship is still docked. so I'm taking my wife with me." "Then I can tell the Admiral you're taking it?" "You can tell the Admiral for me personally that he doesn't have to ask such questions." "Very well. Then you're in command of the Highlander. The message will be relayed to the ship, and you'll receive confirmation as usual. Good luck to you." The following evening, I stood on the dock at Troon. In front of me was my most cherished dream come true. Not a World War I rarity, but a powerful modern destroyer built in 1940. There are only 3 of them left: the Highlander, the Havelock, and the Hesperus. The Harvester had been sunk by a German submarine 2 months earlier. Ah, what ships they were! At the beginning of the war, 9 such ships were launched for our Navy, and 6 more units, slightly modified, were being built for delivery to the Brazilian government. The latter never made it to Brazil and remained in the British fleet. The Highlander was one of the 6. They had a slightly higher overall height than the other ships of the same series, because the Brazilians insisted on installing powerful fans in the living quarters. It was the most beautiful warship I had ever seen. Highlander was the lead ship of 6, and her cabins were fitted up, perhaps, in my opinion, somewhat old-fashioned but very handsomely. The captain's cabin, where he spent his time during the day, measured 15 by 18 feet and was finished with stunning mahogany panelling. There was also a greenish-tiled bathroom and toilet, all for his personal use. There was a separate sleeping area with a large and very comfortable bed. Apparently, things were not bad in the Brazilian Navy, being the lead ship Highlander. Had a separate tableware for the captain, personally a white porcelain set with a thin gold rim on the edges of plates, cups and saucers. At sea, I was also to feel much more comfortable than before. In the sea cabin, besides the bunk I could easily put a chair, there was also some kind of a low coffee table and a chest of drawers. It may seem strange to some that I am describing in such detail items designed to create comfort, but I don't know many Spartans who would treat such an abundance of amenities with complete indifference. By the way, I didn't bring my wife with me. Even before I left, I found out that the ship would not be ready until 3 weeks later, so we decided that I would go by myself first, and she would join me a little later, when I was settled and settled. At first I was puzzled as to why I had been ordered to report to Troon so urgently if the ship was due for a long overhaul. The first thing the watch officer told me was that the new chief mate had come on board half an hour ago, and that the new chief mechanic was expected any minute. So that was the thing. All the new people came on board, and we were given time to get to know each other and get used to each other. I often wondered how much Max Horton knew about the affairs of each individual ship in his group. The Admiral's personal assistant once said Max knows everything. Sometimes I believed that was true, even when it came to such trivial matters as the Admiral was not supposed to worry about. And what could be considered a trifle anyway? A tiny cog in a small gear, when broken, can disable a large machine. It's the same in the Navy. And it was the Admiral's job to make sure the machine never stopped. I was escorted to my quarters, and I immediately saw the senior aide unpacking in the next cabin. He came in, introduced himself, and together we took a detour around the ship. It didn't take me long to realize I was very lucky to have a senior mate, Lieutenant H. E.G. Atkins. Some people, like ships, have an ambivalent, uncertain feeling, and it takes time to understand them, even if you have to communicate with them closely enough. Others make an impression at once, favourable or unfavourable, it is another matter. Concerning Atkins, I had no doubts. He was a tall, slender, handsome, perhaps, to be honest, too handsome a young man, but there was nothing feminine about him. He had the same innate charm that was impossible to resist as the senior mate from the Verbena, Jack Hunter. I remembered Hunter's famous smile well, and maybe that's why I felt like I'd known Atkins for years. I think we both fell in love with the ship as soon as we saw it, and yet, back in my cabin, we both felt uneasy. The atmosphere here made us uneasy. On the way, we stopped 2 or 3 sailors to ask a few questions, and were unpleasantly surprised at the total lack of interest in our personalities. It was strange after all. We were both supposed to be not the last people for them for at least a few months. I was still pondering what this meant, and whether it was worth drawing Atkins' attention to it, when there was a loud knock at the door. After my invitation to enter, a tall and not-so-young senior mechanic appeared in the cabin. Chiff moved slowly and cautiously, for he was very large and seemed clumsy. On first meeting him, I had only gotten a glimpse of the man's outward appearance. Garner was slow in his movements and not much of a talker. If he had been a Scotchman, he would have been called stern and sullen. But we soon learned that these words were the least appropriate to the character of the chief. He turned out to be a pleasant man in every respect, and the more our friendship grew, the more sympathy I felt for him. I note at once that I always use the word friendship very carefully and selectively. The three of us, of course, were united by our love for the Highlander, but at the same time we had a real strong male friendship. Chiff was a good 20 years older than the vast majority of the officers of the Highlander. He had joined the Navy 30 years ago as a green youth, and had retired before the outbreak of war. As he told us, the forthcoming voyage on the Gauze was to be his first after his return to service. Very soon I realized that he was a true sailor at heart. I would never have been able to drive a 2,000-ton ship in a manner that might well have been considered reckless if someone else had been in charge of the machinery. At sea, he always wore white overalls so clean, so spotless, that we often wondered how many times a day he changed his clothes, and how many boiler machinists had been converted into laundresses. Even when we borrowed half a dozen from him to dress the choir at an amateur concert, it seemed to have no effect on the chief's closet. Entering the harbour or going to sea, I always saw a white spot at the rail behind the stern tube. This was the chief standing in his favourite spot. From there he could look through the hatch into his favourite engine room and watch me steer the ship at the same time. I don't know if anyone else had a more demanding viewer. He had served on destroyers in the Mediterranean for a long time, and no matter how well things were going, he still worried, and found something to pick on. After all, there is no limit to improvement. After the mooring was completed, I would run down the gangway to the upper deck and hurry to my cabin aft. He was always in the way waiting. "Nice work, Chiff," I said, knowing that was what he was waiting for. Even a little praise meant a lot to him. "Oh, I don't know, sir. My boys are still pulling the rubber. When working backwards we should be faster." "Damn it, Chef, they backed up as soon as the telegraph rang." "Yeah, but when you're running a ship at speed, seconds can make all the difference. You see, sir, if the boys had been able to send it back a second or two sooner, and if we'd given it a little more revolutions, 180 for instance, instead of 150, then you wouldn't have had to push the ship up to the stop. We'd have been alongside the dock as it was." "Are you suggesting we use 180 turns instead of 150 for the medium forward and medium reverse commands?" "Well, we can try, sir. Thanks to you, I'll be court-martialed for putting the ship in unnecessary danger. Bring your copy of the captain's orders to my quarters, and I'll make the appropriate changes." It was he, after all, who made me run the Highlander the way a destroyer should be run. But I couldn't have done it with anyone but him. At first the chief claimed he was too old to attend officers' parties, but I think it was not age that was to blame. He was a man of very strict morals, and apparently feared that our parties would become licentious. When he realized that we were not at all going to wallow in vice, and were only seeking to have fun to relieve a little tension, he was quite easy to talk himself into changing his cabin for a comfortable chair in the wardroom, like Mr. In the wind in the willows he sat all evening like a kindly uncle indulgently watching the rambunctious children. He was a mentor and friend to each of us, a philosopher, a fine engineer, a first-class officer, and a most pleasant conversationalist. Fortunately, before I left the ship, I was able to recommend him for a promotion, which he certainly deserved, and which greatly affected his pension. As we exchanged farewell handshakes, he hesitantly said, "I am so grateful to you, Captain." "And I'm very grateful to you, Chiff, for your participation in the management of the Highlander," I replied, without a twist of the tongue. But when we first met in Troon, it was in the distant future. All I could say for sure as I crawled into my bunk late at night was that I had been lucky with the officers and the ship. The crew was still an open question. The matter turned out to be even worse. The next day we discovered that something incomprehensible was going on. The list of trespassers was impressively long, and there were 20 or more requests for permission to transfer to another ship. 3 days later, the three of us, myself, the chief mate, and the chief mechanic gathered in my quarters to decide how to proceed. "You know," I said, "I think something has happened here between the officers and sailors. They're predisposed against us, and the captains of these poor fellows have been changing every quarter lately. That said, we can hardly expect this ship to be a happy one. Let's tear up all the old stuff and start over with a clean slate." "What do you mean, sir?" The senior mechanic stared at me in amazement. "Tear up the list of trespassers." "That's exactly what I mean, Chief, the whole damn list. And immediately pardon all those punished. But we have 2 or 3 who got a second class for behavior. That meant that people lost some very valuable privileges for persistent infractions." "You can't do that," the senior aide raised his voice. "Of course I can, at least as long as they stay on my ship. But of course it all depends on whether they'll let me flog those transfer requests." The next morning I cleared the lower deck. The entire crew gathered around the versatile 4-inch gun I was using as a podium. "I want to talk to you," I began. "I'm used to being the captain of a happy ship. There's something fishy going on this one. I don't know what it is, but I intend to fix it. People should have smiles on their faces, and I haven't seen one smiling face since I came aboard the Highlander. Let me tell you what I'm going to do. I have here a list of violators of truly fantastic length. At least 10% of the ship's crew is awaiting my first captain's decision, and another 10% has already been punished. Here it is, this list. Currently, 1 in 5 of the crew is either punished or awaiting punishment. This can't go on any longer. Clearly, I can't do anything where the payments have already been stopped. But everything else is within my power. I can tear up all that paperwork and we can start over. That goes for second-class guys too. But there's a condition. I could clearly see that I'd piqued people's interest, and there was a look of curiosity on their faces. You don't think I'm stupid enough to do all this for nothing? First of all, I don't want to hear anything more about transferring to other ships. There's only one way to leave the Highlander in the future, and that's promotion. As soon as we leave Troon, we'll begin training senior sailors and other specialists. I want you to make this the happiest ship in Londonderry. Now, can I tear up these papers?" I held up a stack of forms. I could see that people were puzzled. They didn't know what to do yet, but the tension in the air had eased perceptibly. At that very moment, some new bond was forming between the team and the officers. I smiled and thought I could tease the men a little well, decide quickly. They laughed too. "All right, you don't have to say anything. I can see the answer. Number 1. Take these papers and put them where they belong." "No, I don't think so. You'll probably stash them somewhere. You'd better give them to the chef, and he'll burn them. It'll do some good." There was a burst of laughter, but I raised my hand for silence. "Now, before I step down from this pedestal, I want to say this: I will not tolerate 2 things. One is failure to report to the ship before going to sea. I want you to always return to the ship, no matter what form you are in. The other is neglect of duty. One more thing. You must remember that an officer's duty is to take care of his subordinates. If you have a problem, go to your officer, and he will solve it. If he can't, I will. With no trespassers on the ship, I'll have time for other things." We found the cause of the trouble. There were too many changes going on here. The Highlander was a senior officer's ship. It had a permanent staff, and the officers didn't have enough time to pay attention to the crew. We discovered surprising things. Some sailors had had pay mix-ups for years, and no one cared. Medals and commendations were not even a question. Promotions were also out of the question. Requests for transfers were replaced by a flood of various requests and complaints. We created a special complaints bureau and did our best to deal with everyone's problems. The number of violations came down to almost 0. Since there were no more violators, the helmsman, who also serves as the ship's policeman, had a lot of free time. We assigned him to do some amateur activities. Our ship was adopted by the city of Perth. While anchored in Troon, we sent a letter to the mayor inviting the city administration to visit the ship. On arrival, they presented us with 3 bagpipes as a gift. Apparently, this was the order of one of the previous captains who had a musical ear. I accepted the gift and expressed my gratitude as sincerely as surprise allowed me. I'm afraid the high-ranking city officials did notice the consternation on my face when the giant package, it was a 4x4-foot cube, was opened on the upper deck because it was too large to bring into the wardroom. I was then asked what I would wish for the ship. I favoured a silk flag to be hoisted on Sunday mornings. This is a very old Navy custom, now almost forgotten. The last time I saw such a thing was on the Hood. Through the kindness of the people of Perth, the flag was sent to us, and it was one of the little things that later turned the Highlander into a first-class ship. We always had problems with the musical instruments and the door to the wardroom. Its size did not allow us to bring in the instruments periodically brought on board by the officers, as they ranged from pianos to harps. In mid-March, we sailed to Tobermory to refresh our knowledge. The team was quite experienced, so we had no friction with the Tobermory nightmare and successfully navigated our way through the challenges and headed to Londonderry to join the B4 band. Since no one knew how to play the bagpipes, we decided to trust 3 sailors to stand on the searchlight platform and hold the bagpipes in the correct, we hoped, position for blowing. With the loudspeaker on, transmitting the bagpipe tunes, the picture was quite realistic. We put this to the test at Tobermory. On a warm spring evening we walked upriver to Londonderry. Boom Hall, with its lovely green lawns down to the river, was busy with the ladies' auxiliary. We saw girls sitting on the grass. As we passed them, we gave them a chance to listen to our bagpipe concert. The reception was so enthusiastic that we seriously considered doing it again. Turning off the loudspeaker, we turned around, reversed course, went quietly down the river, and then again triumphantly past the resting girls, putting our musicians on the platform and turning the loudspeaker on full blast, moving at a much higher speed than the first time. Highlander was a ship on which it was possible to enter the harbour spectacularly at high speed up to 15 knots. It did not create a tailwind. The repeat performance attracted even more spectators. Girls were jumping out of the building to the outside. It's very hard to say at exactly what point things that were going badly before start to go well. We at the Mountaineer didn't like to look back. We had the impression that some obstacle that had previously prevented people from breathing had been eliminated. New ideas, having received the long-awaited freedom, flowed like a fountain. Officers always tried to support good endeavours. We had a soccer and hockey teams that regularly participated in friendly matches. Boats were always launched during anchorages off the coast. Dancing parties were organised for the crew in Londonderry, and parties in the wardroom were not rare, and I could be sure that today's fun would not affect tomorrow's discipline. Intellectual competitions and quizzes were organised at sea, and their effectiveness was especially high when they were conducted over the intercom during the dog watch. People were highly active, constantly inventing something, rehearsing, preparing for something. In general, life got into the right track. My personal contribution to the general was to organise an artilleryman's competition using a 4.7-inch gun. 12 teams from different ship services participated. The officers' team won the first and second rounds, but hopelessly lost the third. Their main opponents were the Gun B team and the team of boiler machinists. The Guns B team considered themselves the best in every way, so they had to experience a real shock when they lost to the boiler machinists, who in turn were defeated by the officers in the final. As a matter of fact, it was bound to happen. The competition was conducted as follows. A smoke shell was fired from the bow gun and exploded at about 8,000 yards. Then the competitors fired 6 shots from the stern gun with shells with screw-in fuses in a certain time interval. On the bridge, I set up a circular sight, which I kept pointed at the smoke target and marked the exploding shells. Considering the high speed of the ship and the side wave, the practice turned out to be excellent. Immediately after the competition ended, a German airplane appeared in the sky. I am sure the pilot had to endure far from the most pleasant moments in his life. The Germans had just developed small airplane shells FAU-1, which could be carried by another airplane until they were in close proximity to the target, after which the radar installed in the nose of the shell was activated, which controlled its movement until it collided with the target. The Germans either didn't know how to judge distance correctly, or they didn't allow that escort ships could carry 4.7-inch guns such as those on the Highlander. Be that as it may, one evening they decided to try their new toy on us. We met the enemy so warmly that he lost control of his shell and it crashed with a crash into the sea halfway to us. That same night the attack was repeated, but we spotted the approaching aircraft on radar in time and opened fire. We didn't see the enemy, but we obviously fired well, as it never came any closer. These planes were based at Bordeaux and could have caused serious trouble for the convoys. They carried not only miniature airplane shells, but also special signal buoys that were dropped a few miles ahead of the convoy. These buoys sent signals that would lead submarines to the convoys. In the morning, another enemy plane flew out of Bordeaux, but our escort aircraft carrier put its fighters in the air, and they shot it down. Highlander was sent to the crash site to pick up the wreckage, but it was obviously too small. We found nothing. Things have clearly improved on the ship. The first results came in. We won the group regatta and the soccer championship. 12 of the 14 sailors who took the chief sailor's exam were from the Highlander. 6 of our senior sealers became petty officers. I worked very hard to help these young men become officers. My life became a veritable idyll. The ship certainly became a happy and very efficient ship. Its high combat capability was constantly confirmed. I could do things I would never have allowed myself to do on the Shikari, for example. If we approached the quay, as a rule, no throwing end ever fell into the water, and if it did, the other would be in the air even before the first reached the water. Thanks to the excellent work of the chief mate, we now spent much less time getting fuel at sea. All in all, life was wonderful. We lacked only one thing: German submarines. In February and March, the enemy boats based at Brest were riddled with Captain Walker and the second support group and put on the defensive. During the summer, many of them were transferred to the area of the expected invasion or went to the docks to install snorkels. True, there were still enough of them at sea to keep us from feeling unnecessary, but with constant air cover provided by escorting aircraft carriers, there was no doubt the German submarines were a defeated team. CMDR. C.W. McMullen was the senior officer of the B-4 escort group. He had settled on the River-class frigate Helmsdale Highlander, was second in command. Our job was to escort convoys to Gibraltar and back. Now the journey was much shorter. We went along the 15th meridian, and the passage took no more than 10 days. In 1941, the same crossing took twice as long, and the route was much longer. Thus we spent 10 days at sea, and then 5 days in Gibraltar. The weather was favourable, and we were genuinely happy every time we came into port, and at both ends of the route. In Gibraltar we bathed a lot. Well, how not to take the opportunity to swim in the warm Mediterranean Sea? Londonderry was a nice place to spend some time. I've always been lucky to make acquaintances on bases, especially in Northern Ireland. On my first visit here, I met a very nice family where I could always count on a warm welcome. There were many beautiful girls from the Ladies' Auxiliary in Londonderry, so my officers also had the opportunity to have fun. The girls of the Western Approaches Women's Auxiliary considered themselves chosen for a high mission, and to some extent they were. They certainly tried to make the officers' lives easier, and despite the claims of our novelists concocting war novels, there were no problems involving the relationship of the sexes. On the one hand, there was simply not enough time for serious novels, and on the other hand, each girl had so many admirers that when one went to sea for a month, another was already ashore. The girls always knew when a particular ship was expected and arranged their affairs accordingly. I find it quite remarkable that in the whole history of the Londonderry base there has been only one very unfortunate incident, and the culprit was an officer from an alien ship not belonging to the Londonderry escort force. One cannot but give Commodore Simpson and his staff credit. These men did a tremendous job, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. If the officers on the ship wanted to organise a party, they informed the Commodore of this, and also of their desire to invite some of the officers of the Women's Auxiliary to it. The place and time were specified. Once confirmed, you would call the commander of the Women's Auxiliary and let her know who you had invited. The girls would arrive on board at the specified time. On the ships they were required to wear uniforms, but at the Allied Officers' Club they were allowed to wear long skirts. The female officer in command of the Ladies' Auxiliary was well in command of the situation. I think she knew the officers assigned to the ship base well, knew what to expect from them. Prohibit it or not, A man and a woman will still find a way to be together. It was useless to fight it. It's much better to acknowledge this fact and provide the proper organization to avoid trouble. In my opinion, this is a pretty good solution to the issue. At our base, that is exactly what has been done. In addition, its geographical isolation made it easy not only to develop rules, but also to follow them strictly. I've heard that we were the envy of the crews of ships from other bases. Londonderry Base had always had a reputation for being first class, ever since the days when Captain Rook Keane had created it from scratch. It was far enough away to establish its own routines, yet close enough to the United Kingdom's naval depots to get all the supplies it needed for its ships. And under Commodore Simpson, excellent training facilities were built here. For example, a domed structure was erected here, on the white vaults of which, using cinematography, it was possible to simulate any angle of attack of an enemy airplane, which trained gunners shot from a light cannon. When the trigger was pulled, spots of light flashed where the bullets would actually hit. The simulator created a surprisingly real picture, and the toy was truly wonderful. Another in the arsenal of Simpson had a teacher of night attack. This was the bridge of the ship, built in the center of the hall, which provided complete darkness. You went there with all the sailors and officers normally on the bridge, the watch officer, the lookouts, the signalmen. Down below was a model of the wheelhouse, where your helmsman was, and a cabin with an automatic plotter, where the navigator and his assistants worked. On the command go, you were told the distance and bearing, and turning the ship in the direction indicated, you were ordered to fire an illuminating shell. Immediately, somewhere under the bridge, magnesia powder would flash, imitating the firing of a gun, and the room would become a little brighter, and with a certain amount of luck you would see an enemy submarine surfacing. There was a camera obscura in the room. Anything that ever happened in the Western Ocean could be replayed on this simulator. If your ship got too close to a convoy, the officer in charge of the class would give you the radar distance and bearing, and when you looked in that direction you would be sure to see a column of merchant ships looming in the fog. The overall environment seemed so real that we sometimes forgot we were on a simulator. Another pavilion was equipped for training ASDIC operators. All the necessary equipment was placed here, connected to an automatic paving machine. In this way, all the realities of a real attack were reproduced. Therefore, if the reader has the impression that we spent our time at the base only in idle amusement, it is wrong. I assure you we were not idle on shore either. About once every 2 months the whole group went to the Philanthus, a training ship of the Western Approaches fleet. Before the war it had been Mr. Tom Sopwith's steam yacht. Now it was stationed at Belfast Lough, with a British submarine permanently attached to it. Our radar and ASDIC operators could get plenty of practice in detecting enemy submarines in underwater and surface positions. By then, Admiral Sir Percy Noble's thesis of the need for training and more training had already begun to bear fruit. Our ocean-going ships now had experienced, well-trained crews, always ready for action. Most of the simulators were operated by officers who had served at sea for many years and knew their business firsthand. Throughout the summer of 1944, we escorted Gibraltar convoys without interference from German submarines. Once Highlander even made a small expedition alone. In late June, 2 days after leaving Gibraltar, we received orders to separate from the B4 group and proceed immediately to a point 50 miles off Cape Finisterre. Extremely excited, we rushed to carry out the order, having no idea why we were sent there. The place where we arrived was dangerously close to Bordeaux, and thus to German aircraft. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, and the pearly white moon was shining brightly in a cloudless sky. Not half an hour later, the radar operator reported that an airplane was circling 5 miles away from us. On such a clear night we would make an excellent target. The German pilot decided to attack. The radar operator reported that it was not one of ours, of course. This did not mean that the plane was necessarily German. It could have been Spanish, for example, although unlikely, since it was flying without navigation lights. To prevent the pilot from seeing the Highlander, I was always trying to keep the ship nose to the plane, so that even in the moonlight the enemy could see only a triangular spot on the moon track, in which it is impossible to recognize the silhouette of a British warship. I had a radar designed to identify targets on the water, so I had a very rough idea of the height of the aircraft. And our radar fire control was homemade. so I would prefer not to engage an airplane in the dark. For some unknown reason, the Admiralty sent the Highlander into the area, but it wasn't to get us sunk. It was a stupid situation. The invisible pilot wanted to know who we were, we in turn wanted to know who he was, and neither side was willing to take the decisive step to clarify the issue. The pilot lost patience first. Judging from the radar readings, he made a rapid approach. Approaching from the side of the moon, he could see me in the moonlight like the palm of his hand, but still could hardly identify the silhouette. He could see the ship from the bow. When he was a mile away, I turned on the navigation lights on the mast and sides. They shone brightly, as in peacetime. It rumbled over our heads, but there was no hail of bombs. My expert said it was a Junkers 290, and that its bomb hatches were open. I confess that I am not an aviation expert and I can hardly distinguish one flying airplane from another. All I know is that it flew too low for me to feel at ease. The pilot seemed to calm down when he saw the navigation lights and moved away towards France. Recognizing a ship from the air was never easy. I remember a story I heard at the beginning of the war about 4 British destroyers that were patrolling in Skagerrak, the section between Denmark and Norway. One of the ships developed a malfunction, so they were returning late. The ships had been spotted from British Blenheim bombers as early as the afternoon, and the pilots were intent on bombing the enemy spies. They were just coming in for an attack when they were spotted by German patrolling Heinkels. The German pilots thought that the British were attacking German ships and felt it was their duty to drive the enemy away. We began to wait for orders for further action. But all was quiet. Midnight passed, an hour, 2 hours, nothing. Eventually the order did come. We were to return to Gibraltar immediately, and as fast as possible. We heard later that His Majesty the King was returning to England after inspecting the army in North Africa, and there were destroyers on duty all along the route. Personally, I was only glad that we no longer had to play cat and mouse with the German Air Force. I called the chief mechanic in the engine room. Returned to Gibraltar at top speed. You hear that, Chief? You always complained about not being able to check how many revolutions our machines can give? Well, consider this your chance. Fire up the 3rd boiler, and let's go. 300 revolutions on the telegraph, but you can give as much as you like. Our course lay right along the moon track on a quiet, perfectly calm sea. Only from the south came long, lazy waves. From the bridge, the surface of the sea directly ahead looked like wavy glass. The ship began to shudder. The electric lag came alive. The ship was picking up speed. It rolled off the top of each wave, raising clouds of fine golden spray. There was a message from the engine room. Boiler 3 is operating, sir. That's fine, Chef. Let's see what you can squeeze out of our machines. I hung up the phone and turned to the watchman. Our old Chief's a baby. I swear when he goes down to the engine room, he leaves at least 30 years upstairs. Quite right, sir. But he loses years not only in his beloved machines, but also in the wardroom. You know how the girls love him. He's got at least 2 at every party. Yes, I've noticed. I laughed. I'll have to tell the XO to invite an extra girl next time, since the Chief can't do without 2. Our conversation was interrupted by the buzzer of the telephone. Yes, Chef. 330? That's great. Is that a record? No. How much is it? I don't think we've ever run faster. Aren't you hoping to add another 10? No, I don't intend to limit you at all. It's all so exciting. When you've satisfied your curiosity down there, come upstairs. We're going to have cocoa in half an hour. I hung up again. The phone rang a few minutes later. 340, sir. Wow. I'm sorry, but I don't have a speed for that RPM on the dial. It ends at 330 RPM, which is 36 knots. I think 10 RPM adds a knot. Come up and feel for yourself what you've got. A few minutes later, his tall, white-clad figure appeared outside the ASDIC room. Just at that moment, the ship came over another crest and 2 waves, like 2 spread birds' wings, scattered on either side of the bow. The rush made the XO rush forward to grab hold of something and stand on his feet, but his face showed not fear but delight. We gave him cocoa. and then he hurried right back to check on his boys to see how they were handling the two roaring monsters, who were closer to him than his own children at that moment. When he had gone, I went down to the tank, took a rope from the bosun's box, and tied it around my waist. Then I made my way to the mooring winch and tied the other end of the rope tightly to a link in the anchor chain. Then I crawled on all fours until I reached the foretop. I had long dreamed of looking down at the water below me from the bow of a ship flying at full speed. I don't think I had ever seen anything so exciting and mesmerizing. Behind me, amazingly white in the moonlight, towered the destroyer. From my vantage point I could see the gun B deck, the signal deck, and the high bridge, whose sturdy panes of glass reflected the moonlight. Ahead was a golden moonlight track, and below was the sea foaming and sparkling with myriad splashes, through which the ship was rushing forward. At first the bow plunged so deeply into the water that it splashed about 12 inches from my happy face. But the very next moment the ship was rising on another wave, and I could see almost the whole of the stem to where it passed to the keel. One moment I was a foot above the sea, which was rushing toward me at 42 miles an hour, but the next moment I was flying a good 30 feet above the surface. Ooh! And the ship was bouncing nose first into another wave. A moment's pause, and the ship would rush forward again, splashing through the golden water in the moonlight. It seemed to me that one could lie like that for hours, watching the mutual movement of the ship, and the water such a sight simply could not get boring. I was at the extreme point of the ship, so to speak, at the tip of the nose, and I liked it very much. For a few minutes I watched the flock of turtles we had caught up with. Amusingly, they swam diligently following for some time, though of course they couldn't move at that speed for long. Interested in their efforts to stay close to the ship, I estimated that they could swim at 50 miles per hour, but for a maximum of 1 minute. At our 42 miles an hour they kept up for about 5 minutes, after which they still stayed well astern, so that their ability to maintain a high speed is about that of racehorses. As there was to be an examination for Chief Sailor on the first day after our arrival at Gibraltar, we were very anxious to get there in time. As we approached our destination, we saw the convoy just entering the strait, and we swept through at full speed with flying colours. We entered the harbour before anyone else. By the way, we've got a new toy. I mean the sign. I found mention of it in the books, and I knew the destroyer had to have a sign. Naturally, I immediately ordered one for use at Gibraltar and at Moville at the mouth of the Foyle River. It is true that we had a very vague idea of what to do with it, but when it arrived there was a great deal of it, far more than we expected. It wasn't until Sunday that we had a chance to sort it out. The only place we knew of in Gibraltar where it could be used was a sandy beach on the Mediterranean coast, accessed via a rather long tunnel. We could not carry the seine in our hands through the tunnel, and besides we expected that the prey would be large enough to be carried back the same way. So we decided to go around by ship, inviting officers from other ships who wanted to amuse themselves. We pulled boats from the Helmsdale and Foley in tow. We figured it would take at least 3 boats to pull the huge sign out to sea, and then back. Highlander was given official permission to go out to sea for practice, which is where we headed with the boats in tow. Having rounded the Cape, we anchored in the immediate vicinity of a luxurious sandy beach. A group of officers and a sign were ferried ashore. The first time the net was thrown unsuccessfully and pulled out empty. But the second catch was simply magnificent, several hundred glistening scales, marvellously beautiful fish, 10 laughing girls from the Women's Auxiliary Service and 3 commanders' treasurers, panting with rage. And they were caught not each individually, but all together in a pile mixed fish, treasurers and military girls. By the way, I did not know that fish scales stick so well to the body. In the end, the whole crew had a wonderful fish dinner. The officers got to spend a lovely evening with the girls, and the treasurers reported me to the commander. I wasn't punished, and why should I be? There are no rules against net fishing on the beach, and besides we had been practicing and had notified everyone we were supposed to. But I think HQ decided to blacklist the entire B4 group, because we've been having problems in Gibraltar ever since. Everything the group did turned out to be nothing more than a brazen escapade, and the more closely the headquarters people watched us, the more serious things happened. The group had an excellent team, and the large wardroom of the Gauze was always buzzing with life. There was no shortage of guests. to avoid the rapid emptying of our officers' wallets, which was inevitable with so many guests and entertainment. At my suggestion, numerous friends from other ships of the group were declared honorary members of our wardroom. This added to the work of the doctor who acted as secretary and took care of the accounts, but our wardroom became the officers' club of B4. Subsequently, most of the raucous parties started on the Highlander, and I am guilty of that. On the way home, the chief was extremely concerned about the fresh water consumption, which in his opinion exceeded all reasonable limits. After leaving Gibraltar, we had to wash our white tropical uniforms, but there was no time for that on shore, so we used more water than the ship's evaporators could supply. The warning posted on the bulletin board had no effect. Then the chief came to me on the bridge. "We're in a desperate situation, sir. Fresh water will run out completely before we reach Londonderry." "How much must be saved to give you peace of mind, chef?" "The consumption must be halved, sir." Signalman. "Sir? Give me a piece of paper, please." I wrote another announcement and gave it to the chef, who, grinning, took it to the notice board. But the situation didn't change. 2 days later, during the noon watch, the assistant boatswain announced, "Cleaners to the corvette at once. Bring your buckets with you." There the chief and a group of mechanics were waiting for the assembled men. Armed with hammers and chisels, they quickly made holes in the middle of the wall of each bucket, which immediately brought the water flow rate in line with the capacity of our evaporators. I did not know how the sailors would react to this, but it turned out that my fears were in vain. They had a lot of fun with their mangled buckets, and even proudly showed them to their buddies from other ships. From then on, anything that was not excellent in every way was said to be as useful as the buckets on the Highlander. We were on our way home when the long-awaited D-Day came. Everyone was wondering if the German submarine fleet would try to strike back. No such attempt was made. One could only wonder that such a large-scale, truly grandiose operation was a surprise for the enemy. Once in Gibraltar, when many officers were gathered in Commander McMullen's office, someone raised the question of where exactly the invasion would take place. We sought out maps of the English Channel and, after careful study, decided that in our opinion there was only one suitable area for it. That is where the landing actually took place. We can only note once again that the Germans are a purely land-based nation and have the mentality of land rats, otherwise they would certainly have provided a more serious defence of the eastern coast of the Cherbourg Peninsula. Before the next convoy left for Gibraltar, the Helmsdale became docked for boiler cleaning, and I was the senior officer of the group. We reached Gibraltar without incident and anchored together in the harbour the Highlander, the captain's class frigate Foley, and 4 Castle-class corvettes. Charles was an old crony of mine. He was an old serviceman from the Bristol division of the CWDR and commanded an excellent, very efficient and combat-ready ship. Among his many eccentricities, and Charles Bird was certainly a hardened individualist, was an unyielding determination never to change the ship's watch. The Foley always lived on British double daylight, saving time, no matter how far westward they travelled. Some sense was certainly made of it. Every day the clocks were changed automatically, so that no one would be offended. Charles decided to fight this nonsense. As a result, one day when the war tracks took us farther west than usual, the crew of the Foley had to eat breakfast at noon and dinner at midnight local time. Clearly the orders on Bird's ship did not affect us, but still the reports from the Foley were sometimes surprising. The time after tea was traditionally considered very convenient for all sorts of experiments with radar and gauges, but before asking the Foley for cooperation, one should always remember what time it was. Otherwise, an offer to work together might well be met with the reply, "Sure, if you're ordering it, why don't you wake people up?" I have characterized Charles in such detail only because he played a significant part in the events that took place during the 5 days' anchorage at Gibraltar, when the group was at the height of its unpopularity, with the Admiral and his staff. We docked on Wednesday, and as there was to be a big concert of our amateur soloists the next day, we remooring in the morning, putting the Highlander between 2 corvettes. In this way there were many convenient places from which we could see the stage built on our main deck. By the beginning of the concert our decks, as well as the decks of the ships on both sides of the Highlander, were filled with people, to whom we distributed printed and reproduced copies of the new song, The Hymn of the Highlander. From behind the curtain covering the stage came the sound of heavy hammer blows on something metal. When the curtain rose, the audience saw a certain character who looked suspiciously like me, laboriously punching holes in brand new buckets. A policeman came on the scene. "Hey, what are you doing here?" "Buckets for the Highlander." "Highlander. What's a Highlander?" "What, you've never heard of Highlander? Then listen up. We'll sing you a song about him." At these words, a choir came on stage and began a song chosen after a competition in which every member of the team could take part. It was a joint work of the 4 chief helmsmen, who shared the deserved prize. The concert turned out great. It is even amazing how much talent can be found among the most ordinary people if you overcome their natural shyness. The next day, Thursday, we moved the ship to the dock again. In the evening I had dinner with Charles Bird. When we returned to the ship, we found a grand party in full swing in the stateroom of the Highlander. The night was sweltering and hot, so it was quite difficult to stay indoors. In addition, the ship had guests several representatives of the Women's Auxiliary Service who worked in Gibraltar as codebreakers. Someone suggested taking a boat to get some air. The boat was just about to leave when Charles and I boarded. I was persuaded to join the walkers and take a seat at the helm. Somebody had taken care to bring explosive packets with them, and, in what must have been a daring experiment, quietly threw one overboard. It exploded noisily underwater, scaring the girls. More interesting was another effect of the underwater explosion, a very beautiful phosphorescent circle on the water. The sight was really unusual. The girls loved it, and we blew up a few more packages. Then we drove around the bay some more, marvelling at the unexpected activity of the Coast Guard. They must have had some kind of drill. The night darkness was cut by long bright fingers of searchlights, beautiful too. What can we say? We didn't realize that there were so many searchlights on the shore. Do they hide them or what? When we got back to the ship's side and the petty officer helmsman caught the end, I was handed a notebook with a message written on it. It was from the commander. "Information received that shells have been exploding from your boat in the bay. Report the name of the officer responsible for this outrage." The girls had already gotten off the boat. I showed the paper to my comrades and looked around. In the boat were all the captains of the ships of the group, and at least half of the senior assistants. I dutifully made a list of those present. "What about the girls, sir?" "There are 11 names on that list. Mine is the 12th. I waved the sheet and shook my head. No one would believe that there were at least 11 other girls with us. "I'll go to the headquarters and give this paper personally." So I went to headquarters. The captain on duty gave me the biggest beating I'd ever gotten. At the end of it, I felt like a delinquent schoolboy. Because of us, the whole coast garrison had been put on the alert, or, to use our parlance, had taken their places on the battle list. Even the governor was notified. The soldiers thought our first underwater explosion was an enemy attack, so the admiral ordered the officer responsible for the disturbance to be put under arrest. But since it was impossible to arrest all the commanders of the escort group and half of the senior assistants, I was told that the flagrant outrage would be reported to the commander of the Western Approaches Fleet in the most detailed manner, and he would deal with the offenders on his return. When I returned to the ship, I found all the commanders in their quarters. "I managed to keep the girls out of it," I reported. "They wanted to put someone under arrest, but they can't lock us all up. Apparently they've alerted the entire garrison and even alarmed the governor. I wonder how they pissed off the governor. Perhaps with a shot of Benzedrine, or a portion of his own excellent sherry. The latter was an allusion to the occasion when I got the governor's sherry from the cellars of Saxon Speed. Be that as it may, I sighed, "Get out of here. You're nothing but trouble for me." And I escorted everyone out of the cabin except Charles. "Is it serious?" he asked. "Very serious to me. I am the senior officer of the group, and I was on the boat myself. In addition to my own sins, I have to answer for yours. It's a pity McMullen is cleaning the boilers, or he'd be here too. What about the wedding tomorrow? Shall we go?" One of the staff officers married a cipher officer, and there was a big reception at the yacht club. We were both invited. Unless, of course, it occurs to you to throw explosive packages at the bride. Then I won't take you. So, what's it going to be? By boat. Of course. We'll take my boat, not that American mule you call a boat. I'll try to get it fixed up. Can you imagine they say we're unbehaved and a disgrace to the rank of naval officer, so our boat just has to be the most elegant boat in Gibraltar. The next morning, it was Sunday, I had to make another routine inspection of one of the ships of the group. During the Londonderry anchorage, the men are mostly on leave, and it was decided to inspect one ship on each visit to Gibraltar. Before going off to do my duties, I ordered Atkins to have the cutter ready by 3 o'clock. And it was indeed ready by that time. The old paint had been scraped off all the brass parts and they shone with pre-war brightness. The bulkheads and floorboards were scrubbed to a pristine whiteness. The hooks of the pinnacles seemed golden in the sun. The stern hatches were draped with blue and white cloth and the canopy was decorated with fringe. It was a beautiful gift from the crew, who of course knew of all the trouble. I do not know how many people worked here, but this boat could rightfully take a place at the starboard gangway of the flagship. There was not a single flaw in it. As I followed Charles down to the boat, I thought that it might all be over soon, and I had no desire to develop that unpleasant thought. A very familiar figure stood at the helm, and as I stepped on deck, the helmsman saluted. Helmsman, why are you dressed like that? The chief petty officer helmsman of the Highlander was dressed in the uniform of a senior sailor. You see, sir, I couldn't trust the helm to these young sailors. They don't know anything and they're bound to do something wrong. They're inexperienced. It'd be all right if it was a normal day, but we can't have any slip-ups today, can we, sir? That's very kind of you, helmsman. We've got a foreman in the bow rower today, and a foreman aft, and a foreman down by the car. You mean to say the yeoman's mess hall is empty today? Quite right, sir. Well, I hope you'll all come to my quarters at 6 o'clock tonight for a drink, and since you're impersonating others today, bring the real crew of the boat with you. All right, let's go, helmsman. As we crossed the harbour to approach the yacht club dock, we saw boats from other ships coming in the same direction. Some were already dropping off guests at the pier. The boats were different good, bad generally faceless. We waited for our turn. At last it came. Petty officers with buggers stood at the side. Sitting under the awning, I could talk to the helmsman. Shall we approach in style, helmsman? You always say yourself, sir, it's dangerous. Do I? Well, yes, but not now, sir. There's always a special relationship between the captain and the chief petty officer helmsman. It is this man who takes the helm in battle, and when the ship enters or leaves port, in other words, at the most crucial moments. I do not know what can reassure more reliably than the voice of a trusted helmsman from the voice trumpet proclaiming helmsman at the helm, so it is a guarantee of reliability. He is the man who carries out your orders, in a way an extension of you. The engine room gong sounded 3 times. The propeller spun frantically in reverse, foaming the water astern. Another gong sounded and the propeller stopped. The boat swayed slightly, pushed by the current. 2 buggers dropped synchronously, catching the eye bolts on the dock. I jumped ashore, Charles following me. Thanks, helmsman, nice work. Hang on a bit. I'll be back in about an hour. There were many eyes watching our arrival. It was not unnoticed how dashingly the boat worked backwards and moved away from the dock. Commander G.O. Simons, formerly anti-submarine officer to Howard Johnston on the Malcolm, was already hurrying towards us. It was worthy of a B-12 native, but for God's sake, be careful. The staffers want to shoot you, but they don't know how to do it. They decided to trust Max Horton with the job. They'd give the rifle to him. There was only one Sunday left before leaving Gibraltar, and I thought all the trouble was over. In the morning, after the usual formation, I returned to the ship, leaving the chief mate to prepare the men for the march to church. In the square in front of the cathedral, they were to march in formation in front of the admiral, who, with the captain and staff officers, took the parade. Captains from other ships were also required to attend, and the captains of the ships in our group were going to cross the harbour in the cutter Gauze to avoid a rather long and tedious walk along the shore. Suddenly I heard Atkins run down the gangway and rush to his cabin. I hurried after him. What happened? Number 1. Tripped, damn it, and landed right in a puddle of oil. I'll have to change my shorts, socks and shoes, sir. All right, I'll send the men out, catch up with you later. I went down to the dock again and ordered the group of sailors closest to the road, left march on they withdrew. As I returned to the side of the ship, I saw Atkins coming down the gangway. He looked around worriedly and exclaimed, "Sir, you've sent the wrong men. We should only send 40 men, but that group has at least 150 and includes Roman Catholics, Jews in fact, all of them. It's too late to make any changes anyway. You'll have to work hard enough to catch up with them." We loaded onto the boat and hurried to our strategic position in front of the cathedral. Groups of sailors from different ships were already marching along the road. The first columns were small 2 or 3 dozen people each. Then came sailors from destroyers. Each column had 40 people. People from the Highlander went last. Apparently they were delighted with the confusion that had occurred. They walked in perfect formation, stamping their step against them. The rest of the crowd looked like a bunch of slackers. The only downside was that there were 4 times as many men from the Highlander as were needed. The captain turned to me, a look of burning curiosity on his face. "You have a hell of a lot of people going to church." It took all my willpower to keep from laughing and to keep a proper expression on my face. "Yes, sir. We have a very religious crew." As the captain of one of the corvettes later remarked, the captain looked as if he had survived an underwater explosion. So the Highlanders marched in formation into the church, believers and non-believers together. But there wasn't enough room for everyone. The column stopped half inside, half outside, while the frightened church attendants fussed in search of chairs. By the way, when I spoke of the team's religiosity, I was hardly being facetious. On the first Sunday at sea, the XO came to me and suggested holding a church service. I had never before been on a ship that had the necessary room and atmosphere, and besides I was firmly convinced that such events should be attended voluntarily. So I replied to Atkins that I could try it, but people should know attendance was not compulsory. Half an hour later, a church was erected on the living deck. Going downstairs, I was extremely surprised that virtually all the crew members free from watch had shown up. The event was so successful that the following Sunday we engaged an amateur choir, and from that time on the ship was often heard singing during dog watch as the choir learned hymns for the next Sunday service. When we put to sea on Monday morning, I breathed a sigh of relief. But we weren't done with Gibraltar yet, and neither was he done with us. We had not spent an hour at sea when the gyrocompass failed, and we had to return to port for repairs. And we were back before the signal tower brought our message of what had happened. Without waiting for permission to moor, we approached the pier, and so quickly that people were pouring out of the captain's office to avoid missing the wreck. By the time a staff officer came aboard to find out what had happened, I was already ashore trying to get on the phone with the repairmen. 2 hours later we left port again and caught up with the convoy at sea. Halfway home we received orders for the convoy to enter St. George straight from the southwest, rather than go around Ireland from the north. Brest had fallen, and there was no longer any fear of submarines in the Bay of Biscay. On arrival at Londonderry, I was somehow not at all surprised to receive an urgent summons to the commander. That same night I left for Liverpool. First I went to the Chief of Staff. He looked up from his papers and said, "The commander wants to see you." That's exactly what I feared. A little later I entered the reception room, and the secretary cheerfully announced to me, "Come in and wait a moment. The Admiral wants to see you." You could have said something new. Out of the Admiral's office came his assistant, a charming lady, an officer of the Women's Auxiliary. Smiling, she said, "The Admiral wants." I know, I exploded. "The Admiral wants to see me. I really want to run home to my mum. I don't like your school. I'd rather have my mum spank me." "What's wrong with you?" "You don't know." "It's not me, but Max really knows everything. Come on in, it's your turn." and I appeared before the highest eyes. Rainer, German submarines have started to appear near our shores. The Castle-class corvettes have already gone to sea many times with different groups, and I think are now quite capable, efficient ships. I'm combining the 6 units into a support group, the 30th, and I want you to be its senior officer. What's the matter with you? It's about this letter, sir. The commander of Gibraltar sent you. He sent me a copy. The commander looked me in the eye without a smile, his gaze penetrating my soul. Ah, that. I don't pay attention to such things. What was I saying, and don't interrupt me again. After a short pause, he continued, these are the best anti-submarine ships we have right now. They have everything on them: the Squid, new radar, new ASDIC, a special echo sounder, and a new radio navigation system with which you can locate yourself day and night to within 50 yards. I was no longer worried about my own fate, so I was immediately alert, sensing a trap. Will the Highlander remain the senior officer's ship? No, the Admiral said. He had already opened his mouth, obviously intending to say something harsh, but seeing my sincere horror, remained silent. I'd rather stay on the Highlander. Are you all right in the head? The Admiral exploded. These are the best anti-submarine ships in the world. But I love my ship. He looked at me with unconcealed anger, but suddenly his face softened, and I saw Max Horton, whose existence I did not even know, wise, kind, understanding. I have already mentioned that I found the key to this great man by accident. He lived for what he gave life to himself. Anyway, he understood my reluctance to leave the destroyer. Don't make life difficult for me, Rainer. You'll have to leave. I think that's how fathers talk to unwise children. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Good luck. Let me know when the group is ready to go to sea. I really need you. After saying goodbye, I headed for the door. Halfway out, the Admiral called out to me. Rainer, did you have a good party? It was, sir. Sir, Horton's eyes twinkled with mischief. I went back to Londonderry to see the Commodore. So you're leaving the Highlander and taking over the group? Yes, sir. I don't even want to think about it, but it looks like it's done. In my opinion, you're just lucky you don't have to go back to Gibraltar. I just got a letter from the captain. From the captain? You had a copy of the letter to the Admiral, didn't you? I have a copy too. But the captain also wrote to me personally. It says that you entered the harbour at a speed of 12 knots. But that's not true, sir. I was heartily indignant. How fast were you going? 140 revolutions, so that's 15 knots. Now then, you know very well what I mean. Gibraltar is getting too hot for you. Take a week's rest, then get a group together. By the way, you may be pleased to know that the commander has recommended you for commander's commission. You'll be the first volunteer reserve officer to receive it. I had previously forfeited my status, as it is logical to have a correspondence to the rank one currently holds. On the Highlander, I was given a festive, one might say lavish, send-off. When the cab pulled onto the dock, it was equipped with towing cables. Half the crew pulled the cab down the main street of Londonderry, and the other half ran along behind. This moment could have been called the happiest of my life, had it not been the saddest.